It's Charter Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance in Long Beach today, and we are joined by Alex Johnson. He is the Executive Director of the Children's Defense Fund in California, also a member of the Los Angeles County Board of Education. I want to speak with you about a couple issues facing children. It seems as if in this decade there's been a lot of focus on trauma and the impact of trauma on children. CDF has been looking at that issue. What exactly is trauma as it relates to the recent studies?
So, Brent, first of all, thank you for having
me.
Trauma is really the challenges that children and young people face as they're going through their environment, whether it relates to school, whether it relates to interaction with gang violence, whether it relates to their issues with abuse, whether it's mental abuse or whether it's post-traumatic stress.
Does trauma need to be, for these purposes, a single event?
Trauma does not need to be a single event. Sometimes it is a series of events that have triggered trauma, but it starts when young people are at their earliest stages. And it is a cycle that persists often in a young person's life.
And what have we learned? What has the CDF learned as it relates to trauma and how using trauma as a lens when treating youngsters?
Well, number one, we've learned that we're not focusing our resources, our investments, whether it's through the state budget, whether it's through local budgets, in a trauma-informed manner. Number two, we've learned that trauma has essentially been allowed to persist. And so when it persists, so for example, the issue of the South Carolina police officer and the young girl who was dragged in the classroom. Essentially, that young lady was a foster child, and so she had already experienced trauma, had been moved perceivably from foster home to foster home, and then was ultimately grabbed and dragged in the classroom. We've learned that we're not addressing it, and that there is more to come. I will say, so this past week I was in San Diego with the Center for Youth Wellness and a number of advocates from across the state as we spoke about how do we address this from a legislative perspective, how do we address it from a budgetary perspective, how do we bring more people into the conversation around addressing but it's really something that we've known for all too long, that if we don't provide kids and young people, children, with the investment that they need early on, then they're going to...
We lose them.
They're going to have bad outcomes on the end.
But what is trauma-informed care? If it's implemented, what does that look like?
So a good example of that is in my job at, or in my role as a school board member on LA County Office of Education, LA County Board of Education. One of the models that we've used is the Road to Success Academy. And I can't take any credit for it. This is Superintendent Delgado and the wonderful staff and teachers at LACO. But it's essentially bringing wraparound services, putting a holistic approach, looking at the whole child in that school setting. So LACO, as you know, operates schools in our juvenile probation camps. And we also operate School for the Arts and an I-Poly school. But the School for the Probation Camps, in the probation camps rather, is where, frankly, we need the most attention. And so thanks to the superintendent and thanks to that staff, that administration, those teachers, those probation officers, they have provided really this wraparound care to young people.
So for the professional who's offering some of those wraparound services or a specific portion of those wraparound services, what is it that they have been taught or what information are they being given that creates this trauma-informed care?
They're being taught about, you know, really the brain development of young people is one particular issue. Dr. Elizabeth Kaufman out of UC Irvine talks specifically about how young people and their brains aren't developing at the same pace as adults. So we've got to treat young people as young people.
And I would presume that a trauma could stunt some of that growth.
Certainly, certainly.
I was reading your policy paper, and one portion that I found truly inspired was the recommendation to provide culturally responsive care.
Yeah.
You know, one could argue kids are kids, doesn't matter what they look like, green, purple, black, brown, whatever it may be. But it's okay to acknowledge distinctions based upon culture.
Yeah.
And this was brilliant. You're looking at rap therapy.
Yeah.
Tell me about rap therapy.
Well, so we did a report called Helping Children Heal.
Right.
And we looked at best practices across the state of organizations that were using a trauma-informed lens.
Right.
And so really, I mean, we have to meet young people where they are.
Right.
And so how do we connect with them? How do we interact with them and engage with them in a manner which they know best and which they're comfortable with?
And it could be music. It could
be
rap.
Music. Could be music. There's art therapy. I mean, so rap therapy is essentially, allowing kids to express their fears, their emotions, their aspirations in a manner in which they are comfortable with that they have an ease with. And so it's been something that we've seen that's been successful, and so we highlighted it in our recent report, Helping Children Heal.
A few years back, Assemblymember Rob Bonta, who represents portions of Oakland, proposed using trauma-informed care throughout the state. Then ultimately he tried to pull it back. He didn't try, he was cajoled to pull it back to an Alameda County pilot, but then even that was vetoed. So that's 2 years ago. It's 2015-16 now. Can we bring this back up in the California legislature?
Well, AB 174 was a bold move by Rob Bonta, Assemblyman Bonta. When the Assemblyman moved that forward, it was ultimately vetoed. I just don't think people were ready, even in a period 2 years ago.
But what about now?
I think the conditions are right now. And Assemblyman Bonta and others, Assemblyman Thurman,
Tony Thurman,
have been really champions around this issue, and others are being more engaged as they learn about the brain science, as they learn about the impact and the cycle that young people go through.
It's interesting you mentioned my wife, maybe 10 years ago, 10 years ago, faced a significant health crisis. And she was in and out of the hospital for quite some time over a 2-year period. At that time, we had toddlers. There is no question my eldest, who was 4, 5, 6 when this was going on, suffered a trauma. And she's 13 now, but we still can see the ramifications of the trauma of having her mother in and out of the hospital. Presumably a supportive environment. She had her grandparents there, I was there, she had her baby sister there. It didn't matter. It still was traumatic for her to see her mother ill. And I just thought of it as we were talking. We remember that in interacting with her. She will get a little more spooked than most in the context of medical ailments.
Well, think about if those issues are left untreated. Think about if a child witnesses a family member being gunned down, and yet they don't have the mental health treatment that they need. Think about if a child is going from foster home to foster home to foster home, and they aren't being placed in a suitable environment, a stable environment. And so that instability persists over the course of their life. If it's not stopped, if it's not rectified, if there's not an intervention that's played out.
At a minimum, is our schools in Los Angeles County, for example, are they educated as to how to recognize kids facing trauma?
I think
struggling with trauma?
I think there are bits and pieces, right? So we have an opportunity now. We have more school-based health centers in our LUSD schools, and the next push, the wave, is how do we get those mental health professionals in there? How do we add more counselors so that instead of pushing students out of the classroom into the arms of police officers, we're pushing them into the arms of counselors so that they can talk about their issues? That's a trauma-informed lens.
His name is Alex Johnson. He is the executive director of the Children's Defense Fund in California, also a member of the Los Angeles County Board of Education. My name is Brad Pomerance. Thank you so much for joining us on Charter Local Edition.